Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1, where decisions moved slower than boats. In the early fog of Scandinavian mornings, long before Denmark became a modern nation or even a unified kingdom, a curious thing happened on the moors and meadows. People gathered. They were not warriors, though some carried axes, and they weren't kings, though a few claimed noble blood. They were, in essence, freemen, farmers, landholders, petty chieftains, and wandering shepherds alike. They came to participate in a grand democratic experiment that would become the backbone of governance in the Norse world. The Thing. These things were assemblies, not places, but events. Yet over time, the word described both the process and the field on which it happened. Tingsted they called the site. There were hundreds, each attached to a herd, a small district. They met under the open sky, regardless of weather, near ancient trees, mounds, or flat stones inscribed with runes that no one could quite read anymore. This, you might think, is where blood was debated and war was decided. But more often, it was where they discussed the size of boundary stones, or whose sheep had trespassed, or whether a certain man's fence was a hand too close to the public path. The thing was, essentially, bureaucracy before building's process before speed. These gatherings were slow, not by necessity but by custom. A matter could be presented, heard, and then adjourned. Not resolved, just adjourned for the next thing. It was considered improper to rush a matter of public interest, even if the public wasn't all that interested. Imagine the scene. A raised platform of turf or stone, a speaker with a deep voice usually chosen for age or remembered wisdom, and around him, a circle of men leaning on staves, chewing dried fish, occasionally dozing. A matter is brought forth. Olaf claims that the boundary of Sven's farm is marked incorrectly, as the stone was moved during last spring's flood. Murmurs follow. Heads nod. One man coughs. A witness is called. He is late. Another witness is called. He forgot the details. The matter is referred to the lagman, lawman, who recites something in Old Norse that no one quite follows but everyone respects. And then silence. Someone breaks it with the traditional words, "Let it stand until the next thing." Such was the rhythm of governance. The thing was not simply an assembly, it was a ritual. A slow, deliberate murmuring of a people who valued discussion, repetition, and the gentle passing of time. Decisions were made, but over many gatherings. Justice was not swift, it was careful. In this slowness, Denmark found its first taste of order. One of the earliest documented things is the Scania Thing, from what is now southern Sweden but was then under Danish rule. It was held beneath the open sky in what became Lund, and it drew freemen from all over the province. The minutes of the meetings weren't written, writing was still rare, but oral memory held everything. It was considered a virtue to remember each case, word for word. Some men became walking archives. And those archives, men in wool cloaks with soot-blackened teeth, could recite land disputes from 30 winters past, complete with the placement of stones and the angle of hills. Memory was power, and in these assemblies, a sharp memory could win a case more surely than a sword. The thing was also a place of social reckoning. If a man had wronged another through insult, theft, or injury, it was not always the sword that settled it. Often, the thing would assign weregild, a payment based on the injury caused. The price of an eye was known. The price of a tooth, a hand, a broken promise, all were inscribed in the oral code. It was here that justice lived, not in royal halls but in windswept fields where ravens cawed and the wind carried secrets. These were not passionate courts. They were bureaucratic. They dealt in tedium, in custom, in formulas spoken aloud so often that even children memorized them. One could fall asleep in a thing, awaken an hour later, and find the same matter still unresolved, now discussed in slightly different words. It was the very model of slow governance. But the slowness was intentional. In a society where revenge and feuding could tear apart families and villages, the thing offered delay. And in delay came calm. Time softened rage. A postponed hearing gave space for compromise. The boredom of it, all those long discussions and procedural chants, wasn't a flaw. It was the point. By the time kings began to centralize power in Denmark, they didn't destroy the thing. They co-opted it. The king's representatives began to attend. The lawmen became clerks. The words were written instead of spoken, but the soul of the thing, the sacred delay, remained. Even as late as the 17th century in rural areas, things were still held under trees, and proceedings often lasted days, with nothing urgent discussed. Some historians describe these events as social rituals rather than functional governments, and yet, in their slowness, they held the kingdom together. Today, some of those Tingsteder are archaeological sites, a few stones in a field, a plaque, sometimes a tree that is said to be ancient enough to have once heard laws spoken beneath it. But the spirit of the thing lives on in the Danish attachment to process, patience, and deliberation. And perhaps most surprisingly, it lived on in the very structure of parliament. The Danish word for parliament, Folketinget, the people's thing. So what does it mean that the slowest, dullest, most sleep-inducing forum of old became the model for democratic government in a modern European state? What can we learn from a system where time itself was the moderator of anger? And what happened when writing entered the picture, when memory became parchment? By the dawn of the 12th century, Denmark had begun its long, sluggish pivot from a land ruled by spoken customs to one increasingly marked by the presence of ink. The thing assemblies, those windswept, open-air forums of debate and delay, still operated much as they had for centuries. But the world was changing. Christianity had brought more than cathedrals and monks. It had introduced parchment, the Latin alphabet, and the idea that memory might be stored on something less perishable than human minds. The first to take notice were the clerks. Originally attached to cathedrals and monastic orders, clerks were among the few who could read and write. They came from a class of men who had memorized the Psalms before their 12th birthdays and could copy whole chapters of Scripture by hand, their fingers blackened by ink, their eyes squinting under poor candlelight. At first, their presence at the thing was limited. They arrived as observers or as legal advisors to the church. But the slow bureaucracy of the thing, its elaborate memory games, its intricate codes, and traditions appealed deeply to the clerical mind. Here was a system that matched their own habits of thought, deliberate, precise, and ritualized. And so, without anyone formally inviting them, scribes began to record the proceedings. Not entirely, of course. The thing was not a place for comprehensive transcripts, but decisions, especially those involving property, taxation, or punishment, were increasingly recorded. At first, this was a matter of dispute. Some older men resisted. If the law lived in the mind, they argued, why imprison it on paper? But paper was less forgetful than men, and less corruptible. One of the earliest surviving written accounts of thing proceedings appears in connection with Valdemar I, who ruled from 1154 to 1182. Valdemar, a pragmatic king, saw the usefulness of aligning church literacy with state power. He encouraged the documentation of judgments, especially land ownership, perhaps Denmark's most contested and quietly dangerous issue. This was not a revolution, it was a creeping tide. It began with the recording of boundary disputes. In the past, these had relied on the testimony of aged men who claimed to remember where stones had stood in their youth. Now, such matters were put to writing. If you lost your land and your witnesses, the court would ask, "Do you have the document?" And if you did not, the paper itself became proof that you never had the right to begin with. What had once been a performative memory, ritual, was becoming a procedural archive. But the process was slow, exquisitely slow. At the local things, most people still relied on oral argument. Documents were rare, expensive, and prone to misinterpretation. A single misspelling could undo a case. And since Latin was the language of scribes, not peasants, even if one had a document, few could read it. So scribes held power not through wealth or titles, but through interpretation. They became mediators between the spoken word and the written one. In doing so, they inadvertently formed Denmark's earliest bureaucracy, a silent class of recorders, interpreters, and archivists. Some clerks served multiple things, traveling between regions with their portable desks and bundles of scrolls. Others lived near abbeys or bishoprics, tethered to ecclesiastical offices but deeply involved in secular governance. It was during this period that lawmen, once the masters of memory, began to read from texts. The change was subtle but meaningful. Instead of beginning with, "I recall the judgment of," they would instead say, "It is written that." This shift away from personal authority and toward textual permanence would eventually reshape the entire structure of law in Denmark. Still, the thing resisted complete transformation. Most rural assemblies refused to abandon their traditions. Decisions might be written down, but they were still debated in the old way, slowly, communally, with much delay. The process of deliberation remained as glacial as ever, with disputes often carried forward for years. And yet, in the background, an administrative class was emerging. Monks cataloged thing decisions in abbey libraries. Bishops referenced thing rulings in their letters to the crown. A quiet, clerical scaffolding was being built beneath the open-air gatherings. The irony is almost poetic. The thing, so defiantly oral, became the most documented tradition in Danish legal history, not because of its efficiency, but because of its enduring messiness. Every unresolved case, every appeal, every repetition was noted. The very slowness of the process created a paper trail as long as the dispute itself. And what were these disputes about? Mostly land. Always land. The strip between two farms, the wood where pigs grazed, the riverbank that moved during flood season. These cases may seem dull, but in medieval Denmark, control of land meant survival. A misplaced boundary could doom a family. And so, the thing became the arena for fighting such battles, not with swords, but with memories, witnesses, and now documents. Some landowners began to carry their documents to everything, not in books but folded tightly in wax pouches. They were shown, not read. "Here," a man would say, thrusting the seal into view, "here is the record." No one could verify its content, but the seal alone often ended the argument. The seal had become a kind of bureaucratic sword. With it, a man could defeat years of oral history with one flash of wax and string. This was the bureaucratic birth of authority. By the late 13th century, Denmark's kings began to organize this chaos. Royal scribes started keeping master copies of important land grants. A centralized chancery was formed. The first proper archives appeared not just in abbeys, but in towns like Roskilde and Ribe. And the thing, once a place of democratic murmurs, began to feel pressure. Still, it endured. But one must wonder what happened to those who never received a seal or couldn't afford a scribe. What became of the landless men whose memories were rejected by the text? In the quiet revolution of parchment, who was written out? And when did the thing so reliant on human voice become reliant on royal favor? By the dawn of the 14th century, the thing had changed, but it had not disappeared. The open-air gatherings still occurred. The people still came. They still leaned on staves, and they still chewed on fish. But the rhythm of governance was no longer purely theirs. Something colder, more deliberate, more distant had crept into the sacred circle. Central authority, royal bureaucracy. Kings had discovered what scribes already knew: order, even if slow, could be shaped. And shaped order was power. The royal chancery, the king's own writing office, now issued judgments and edicts, most bearing seals so ornate that even local clerks hesitated to challenge them. The thing, once the supreme voice of the land, had become a voice within a larger system. It spoke, but it no longer had the final word. The writing desk had eclipsed the rune stone. It was not a hostile takeover. There were no declarations, no banning of assemblies. Instead, the thing was slowly surrounded by paperwork. Royal decrees arrived. Church documents were read aloud. Scribal records were referenced in disputes. Local decisions were compared to national laws. And still the people gathered. Even now, in the age of expanding royal influence, the thing remained deeply cultural. It was a right of belonging. Attending it marked a man as a freeholder. Speaking there affirmed his voice. Being silent there still present meant he was part of the decision, even if the outcome had already been sealed elsewhere. A paradox took root. The thing was both democratic and impotent, local but tied to distant authority, familiar but increasingly irrelevant. In regions like Scania and Zealand, royal bailiffs began to attend with increasing frequency. These men, dressed in the king's colors, came not to deliberate but to announce. "His Majesty declares," they would say, reading from a scroll, often in Latin. The crowd would listen in silence, half understanding, half resentful. Some would nod, others would cough. A few still raised objections, but increasingly, these were met with references to older rulings, sealed documents, or decisions made at the Lansting, the regional thing assemblies, now dominated by royal-appointed sheriffs and judges. In the city of Viborg, a symbolic turning point was reached when the old thing field was paved over for market space, and the assembly moved indoors to a hall. There, beneath a wooden roof and hanging oil lamps, the voices of the free men echoed against stone walls, but something vital had shifted. No longer open to the sky, the thing was now enclosed, contained. Weather could no longer interrupt it, but neither could the people. The new bureaucrats, the scribes, sheriffs, and seal keepers, sat at raised tables. Their decisions were copied into thick ledgers with worn leather bindings. Some of these survive today, preserved in state archives. They are pages of careful script, noting who owed whom, which field belonged to which man, and which ruling had set precedent. They are to a modern eye dull, but to a medieval Dane, they were the heartbeat of order. The lawman, once revered as a vessel of oral law, now read from written codes. The most famous of these, the Jisk Love Law of Jutland, was introduced in 1241 by King Valdemar II. It codified laws long practiced orally, but with one decisive difference. They were now immutable without royal approval. The Jisk Love opens with the line, "With law shall the land be built, but if all men were to live by their own will, then would each man be judge over the other." It was a noble sentiment, but also a silent warning. The law was now something to be handed down, not drawn out in dialogue. In some places, the thing tried to resist. Elders insisted on maintaining the old forms. Disputes continued to be heard with the slow cadence of habit, but more and more, even the right to speak at the thing required proof of land ownership, and land ownership now required documentation. You needed a paper to speak at the paperless forum. This was the quiet revolution. For a time, Denmark maintained a dual system, oral tradition at the thing, written law in the chancery. But the balance tilted inevitably toward the latter. Kings preferred parchment. So did bishops. Even some wealthier peasants began to prefer it. Those who could afford scribes found their claims more respected. The slow justice of the thing, once admired for its thoroughness, now seemed inefficient in a world accelerating towards central control. Still, not all was lost. In the 15th century, the thing remained important for rituals. Election of local sheriffs, swearing of oaths, announcements of marriages or deaths, all were still done at the local assembly. It was a communal bulletin board, a social calendar, and a court of last resort. And in that quiet persistence lies the legacy. The thing never vanished, it evolved. When Denmark's parliament was established centuries later, It bore the name Folketinget, the people's thing. The deliberative spirit of those open-air gatherings, their slowness, their care, their preference for listening, these became part of the national political character. Even today, Danish law is shaped by consensus, by long discussion, by patient negotiation. The thing still whispers. It is in the patient tone of debates, in the long pauses of parliamentary speech, in the respect for public input, in the quiet halls of government where decisions are not rushed not because they cannot be, but because they should not be. The thing lives on not in fields, but in the soul of the state. Yet we are left with one lingering thought. What did it mean for a society to trade memory for manuscript? When voices gave way to seals, what stories were left untold? And if the thing had survived fully intact, if people still gathered under trees to speak their truths slowly, together, what kind of country might Denmark be today? Story 2. Counting Cows and Peasants, the Royal Census of 1231. It is difficult, in our modern age of databases and spreadsheets, to imagine the strangeness of the year 1231 in Denmark, a year in which every cow, every barrel of barley, and every tenant farmer was suddenly of interest to the crown. Not for reasons of war, not for reasons of pride, but for something far more tedious and far more profound. Taxes. That year marked the first comprehensive attempt in Danish history to catalogue the kingdom's resources, an enormous and monotonous effort now remembered, albeit dimly, as the Valdemar Jordebog, King Valdemar's land book. It is among the oldest administrative records in Danish history, and perhaps the dullest unless you happen to care deeply about oxen. And Valdemar the victorious, reigning king of Denmark at the time, most certainly did. This was not a time of peace. Just 2 years earlier, Valdemar had been taken hostage by Count Henry of Schwerin during a hunting trip, an embarrassing and costly affair that ultimately involved Denmark surrendering vast lands in exchange for the king's release. Upon returning to his throne, Valdemar faced a weakened treasury and an urgent need to understand exactly what his kingdom still possessed. Not in theory, in detail. And so the kingdom's administrators were mobilized. They were not knights or generals, but scribes, bailiffs, and weary clerks with quills and ink pots, tasked with creating a complete inventory of the royal lands village by village, field by field, beast by beast. It was, in a way, the most boring army ever assembled. And yet, their mission was as vital as any. The mechanics of counting. The Jordebog was not a single book, but a series of records parchments filled with lines of precise, repetitive Latin. The clerks wrote with narrow script, conserving every inch of space. What they recorded was startling in its specificity. How many pigs lived in a particular village? How many plow teams could be assembled from a certain estate? How many barrels of malt a tenant was expected to produce? In Lolland, for instance, one entry listed the landholdings of a minor noble who owed the king a set number of hawks each spring. Elsewhere, a fisherman near Ringsted was noted for contributing eels 200 of them, annually. It was a bureaucracy of bizarre precision. Each village was not only recorded for its population or its produce, but for its obligations. A peasant might be listed not by name, but by what he owed. 1 cartload of peat per season, 2 hens and a silver coin at Michaelmas, or a day's labor in the king's forest during harvest. Even measurements were inconsistent, defined not by standardized units but by tradition. A barrel of barley might vary depending on the region. A day's work could mean 10 hours or 3, depending on whether you were tilling heavy clay or clearing brush. This inconsistency created chaos, but it also created opportunity. The Jordebog served not merely as an economic inventory, but as a tool of negotiation. Local lords could argue down their taxes by questioning their entries. Peasants could claim their ox had died, or that last year's frost had rendered their barley harvest worthless. Still, the crown insisted on the numbers. The project may seem mundane, but for Valdemar it was a question of survival. His kingdom had been shaken. The loss of German territories to the south had shrunk Denmark's reach. Rebellions in the Baltic Islands were stirring. And to maintain his hold on power, Valdemar needed money, not promises, not loyalty, coin. And coin came from knowledge. Not just knowledge of how many peasants lived in Skane or how many horses grazed near Viborg, but of how deeply he could lean on his own lands, how much could be squeezed, taxed, harvested, or borrowed against. And so the record keepers marched on. They traveled through muddy paths, visited manors and abbeys, peered into grain stores, lifted barn doors, and questioned tenants who stared at them with blank suspicion. To most peasants, the royal census was not an act of governance. It was a reminder of distance, a hand from far away reaching into their daily bread. They complied mostly, but grudgingly. In some areas, villagers delayed the clerks with vague answers. In others, they presented their animals in ways that suggested poverty, moving them out of sight before the scribes arrived, or claiming the sick had died just days before. The clerks learned quickly. They made notes. They cross-checked accounts with monks and landlords. If one village claimed a poor harvest but the local abbey reported otherwise, the record was adjusted. Slowly, a picture of Denmark emerged. Not a picture of glory, but of mud and cabbage. And this was the true genius of the Jordebog. It stripped away illusion. Denmark's power was not in castles or conquests. It was in grain, in herds, in long stretches of farmland with names only a handful of scribes would remember. It was a portrait of ordinariness and of extraordinary survival. Bureaucratic consequences. The implications were vast. For the first time, the crown could compare estates. It could determine whether a noble was living beyond his dues, or whether an abbey was hiding its surplus. It could, in theory, redistribute land or adjust taxes with logic. In reality, of course, it often reinforced inequality. Nobles negotiated, clergy exempted themselves, peasants paid. But even these injustices were now written down. And once written, they could be questioned perhaps not in 1231, but in the years to come. For scholars, the Jordebog remains a fascinating window. We learn that falcons were valued, that eel fisheries mattered more than one might think, that barley was the lifeblood of rural Denmark, not just for bread but for brewing, that some peasants owed oxen and others owed hours' labor as currency. We also learn about the silence, because not every village was listed. Some areas are strangely absent. Historians debate whether these omissions were clerical errors, evidence of destruction, or simply signs that royal authority didn't reach as far as Valdemar had hoped. And what of the people? Their names are mostly lost. They are referred to as the tenants of such a state, or those who owe. Only rarely does a personal name appear, often that of a bailiff or landholder. The individuals are shadows, yet their obligations are crisp. The irony is clear. The people who carried the kingdom on their backs were measured not by who they were, but by what they gave. So we must ask, when a kingdom knows the number of chickens in a village but not the names of its children, what kind of governance has it truly achieved? And if knowledge is power, who controls the questions? When King Valdemar's scribes gathered around their heavy oak desks in the chancery halls of Roskilde or Ribe, they did not imagine they were creating a record that would outlive them by centuries. They were merely performing a task defined by rows, columns, ink, and repetition. Yet within those dull lines, a slow transformation was underway, one that would shift the very balance of power in Denmark. The Jordebog had begun not only to count things, but to define them, to mark land not simply as territory, but as taxable units, to see peasants not as subjects, but as sources, and to treat tradition not as sacred, but as negotiable so long as it was documented. This was not a revolution of swords, but of seals, and it began to reorder the kingdom quietly. Beyond the count, the implications of a ledger. As the royal census expanded and more entries filled the parchment, Denmark itself became more legible to the state. Before this, a king's understanding of his lands was often anecdotal. He knew what his vassals told him, which lands paid what rents, which abbeys were generous with their tributes. But anecdotes could lie. A ledger could not, at least, not without someone to blame. The Jordebog made Denmark measurable. It mapped the kingdom through quantity. That field yields 5 barrels. That tenant owes 4 hens. That abbey controls 2,000 hides of land and pays a tenth in butter and cheese. The language of governance became numeric. And where numbers ruled, judgment followed. Once recorded, these values began to shape decisions where to invest royal patrols, which regions deserved lower taxes after floods or famine, and which noble estates seemed suspiciously underproductive. Discrepancies triggered inquiries. Some landholders were summoned to explain why the king's share had dropped. Others were asked to provide soldiers, wagons, or grain according to the figures they themselves had confirmed. It was a feedback loop of accountability, and yet uneven. The powerful, of course, knew how to negotiate. A bishop could argue his figures were sacred. A wealthy noble might suggest that poor harvests were due to divine punishment. Who was the king to question providence? But the peasant, he had no parchment, no advocate. His entire existence was mediated by others. If the village bailiff reported 5 pigs, then 5 pigs were expected regardless of whether disease or theft had taken 2. The ledger was truth. Life was merely expected to match it. Thus, the census did more than record. It created reality. Bureaucracy as order and oppression. To modern ears, the term bureaucracy may sound tedious, but in the medieval world, it was something closer to miraculous. A functioning administrative system, one that could organize goods, levy resources, and regulate justice across hundreds of miles, was an exceptional feat. And Denmark was among the first Scandinavian kingdoms to attempt it at this scale. At its best, the Jordebog brought stability. For those whose land holdings had been disputed, the census was proof of ownership. For abbeys under threat, it formalized privileges granted generations prior. Even some peasants gained protection if their labor obligations were clearly stated. Local lords could not legally demand more. But the system, like all systems, was double-edged. The same record that protected a man's barley harvest also locked him into permanent obligations. You owe 2 bushels each spring, the record might say. Never mind that the river flooded last year or that a pestilence reduced the crop to straw. The ink said 2, and so 2 must be delivered. Worse still, the census introduced permanence to inequality. Before the Jordebog, a man's status was defined more by custom and local relationships. Now it was etched into a record. If your father was listed as a tenant owing 10 days of labor per year, you likely inherited that status. There was no procedure for adjustment. The document said what it said. And documents did not forget. The invisible majority. Perhaps the most haunting feature of the 1231 census is its anonymity. The names are rare. Mostly the Jordebog references titles, locations, duties, the tenants of the estate at Hald, the servants of the manor near Vissenbjerg, the fisheries of the Bishop of Aarhus. Even when individuals appear, they are typically lords, monks, or royal officers. The majority of Danes, the farmers, shepherds, millers, charcoal burners, remain unnamed. They were known not by who they were, but by what they owed. This was not an oversight. It was design. Names were irrelevant to taxation. What mattered were yields, obligations, and productivity. The identity of the tenant mattered less than the value of his barley or the weight of his wool. And yet in these blank spaces, entire lives unfolded. Consider the unnamed man who owed 2 geese and 3 bushels of rye each harvest. Did he live with a family? Did he struggle during cold winters? Did he fear the clerk's visit or welcome it as a rare sign of the king's presence? We do not know, but the record says the geese were expected. Local resistance, subtle sabotage. Despite the ambition of the Geordie-Bog, compliance was never perfect. In remote areas, especially in the marshes of southern Jutland or the forested outposts of Funen, local resistance was common. Villagers delayed the scribes, sent them to the wrong fields, or hid livestock. Sometimes entire communities conspired to report smaller yields. And occasionally, clerks colluded. Not all royal agents were loyal. Some were bribed, others were sympathetic. A scribe might report a poor village as wealthier if a lord wished to impress the king, or poorer if a tax reduction was desired. The crown knew this, which is why entries were often cross-checked with church records or verified by bailiffs who traveled separately from the scribes. It was a slow, imperfect web, but it was a web nonetheless. And each failed deception led to tighter control. Eventually, the mere knowledge that a village had been listed in the Geordie-Bog became a kind of pressure. The presence of record implied surveillance, even if no one came again. The people had been counted, and that changed them. Bureaucracy as legacy. The Geordie-Bog did not last forever. Over time, many of its entries were lost or absorbed into newer records. Some parchments were damaged by fire, others by damp, others simply forgotten in monastic libraries. But parts of it survive fragments of a grand and boring ambition. Historians today regard the 1231 census as a milestone not just for Denmark, but for medieval governance more broadly. It was among the earliest attempts in Europe to systematically catalog a kingdom's economic landscape, not through conquest, but through counting. It was not glamorous. It was not heroic. But it made a state, and it left behind a haunting realization. When we seek to know everything about a people, what they own, what they produce, what they owe, we may lose sight of who they are. And what is a kingdom that can measure its grain, but not its grief? As the final entries of the Geordie-Bog were inked by scribes in the chancery, Denmark entered a new phase of self-awareness. It was no longer simply a kingdom of fields, forests, and fisheries. It had become, in a peculiar and quiet way, a kingdom made of lists. Scrolls replaced memory, values replaced relationships, and as these records passed through royal hands, Denmark found itself subtly transformed not by sword or sermon, but by the act of documentation. The Geordie-Bog was not just a census, it was the bureaucratic soul of a kingdom. From record to rule. Once written, the census data did not rest in shelves. It was used slowly, incrementally to justify royal decisions. Taxes were levied more precisely. Exemptions were scrutinized. Military obligations were calculated based on holdings. Even disputes over land were now arbitrated with reference to the records. Peasant revolts, rare but present, were occasionally blamed on these new, precise demands. We gave as our fathers gave, some villagers argued, but now we are told the book says we owe more. The idea that a document compiled by men they had never met could override ancestral practice was both bewildering and at times infuriating. But it was also final. The written record replaced the spoken tradition. Appeals based on custom fell before the written clause. If your duties were in the Geordie-Bog, they were truth. And truth, once bureaucratized, became a kind of quiet power. Even in the king's court, nobles began citing the census in disputes. This land, a baron might say, unfurling a dusty scroll, was listed under my grandfather's holdings. And unless someone could produce a contradictory scroll, the matter was settled. What had once been spoken in the open air of the Thing was now whispered in chancery halls. The evolution of the Danish state. The Jordebog laid the groundwork for a more centralized state, one that extended beyond the charisma of kings or the power of warriors. It was a government of ink, and while its scope was limited by the reach of royal scribes, its logic was contagious. In the decades that followed, Denmark continued refining its administrative machinery. New forms of record-keeping emerged: church tithing lists, toll records, town charters. The principle was the same: count, record, control. By the 14th century, Danish monarchs no longer governed simply by decree. They governed by precedent. The Jordebog had shown that knowledge could be power, but only if recorded. The legal mind replaced the heroic one. The bureaucrat replaced the chieftain. Slowly, Denmark became modern not through industrial might, but through catalogued minutiae. Fading ink, lasting shadows. Of the original Jordebog, only fragments survive today. But what remains is extraordinary, not just for its age, but for its content. It reveals the everyday structure of a medieval world: the hierarchy of barley, the economics of herring, the legal value of labor. We see not great events, but small truths. A man in Funen owed a hawk to the king. Another near Aalborg was taxed in butter. A monastery in Viborg held land so fertile it could produce 10 barrels of rye from a single hide, and so it paid more. These are not stories one tells at feasts, but they are the bones of a kingdom. More than any battle or treaty, the Jordebog tells us how Denmark functioned. Not how it dreamed or ruled or fought, but how it worked. And in this way, it reveals the foundation of every society, the quiet systems that sustain power. Reflection: bureaucracy in human lives. What makes the 1231 census so compelling despite its deliberate dullness is what it omits. It tells us about goods but not about hunger, about obligations but not about suffering. We know what the peasants owed but not what they hoped. We know the number of pigs in a village but not the sound of their squealing at dusk or the faces of the children who fed them. The Jordebog is a triumph of administration and a tragedy of anonymity. For in cataloging the kingdom, Denmark became in some ways less human. People became data, and data, while powerful, does not weep. Even today, in our world of statistics and ID numbers, echoes of this remain. We measure societies by GDP, not joy. We track productivity, not peace. We know the numbers, but not always the lives behind them. So we return to 1231, to a land of grain and ledgers, and we ask, what do we lose when we know everything about a kingdom except its people? Story 3. Harold Bluetooth's clerks, writing Denmark into order. Long before he became a name in every smartphone settings menu, Harold Bluetooth Gormson ruled over a Denmark that was fragmented, stubborn, and only just beginning to imagine itself as a unified state. He is remembered in grand terms by the gelling stones, those massive runestones carved around the year 965 that proclaimed, in Stoic Norse, King Harald made the Danes Christian and united Denmark and Norway. But stones do not govern. For that, Harold required something far less glamorous and infinitely more tedious: a class of men who could write. The reign of Harold Bluetooth marks one of the earliest known transitions in Danish governance from oral tribal custom to written royal administration. It is the dawn of paperwork, the bureaucratic birth pangs of a nation not carved in granite, but scrawled in ink on scraped animal skin. This was the rise of the clerks. They came from monasteries, from bishoprics, from the slowly spreading centers of Christian learning. Armed with Latin, quills, and an unshakable devotion to process, they brought order not through conquest but through record-keeping. And what a strange and sleepy revolution it was. From axe to ink. Harold did not inherit a cohesive kingdom. His father, Gorm the Old, had ruled a patchwork of tribal regions held together more by custom and charisma than by any centralized force. Loyalty was personal, authority local. When Harold declared himself king of all Denmark, it was more ambition than fact. To make it real, he needed a system that extended his reach beyond shouting distance, one that outlasted his voice, one that could deliver his will to lands he had never visited, to men who would never meet him. He needed the written word. But there was a problem. The Norse script, the runes etched into wood and stone, was poorly suited for administration. It lacked precision, it lacked standardization, and most crucially, it lacked bureaucracy. So Harold turned to the church. In converting to Christianity, he did not merely adopt a religion. He adopted its infrastructure. Churches came with clerics. Clerics came with training. And training came with a commitment to documentation. Within a generation, Denmark's first clerical class began to form. They did not wear armor. They did not speak Norse. They were fluent in Latin, in scripture, and in the art of recording obligations. They were, in essence, royal librarians with jurisdiction. What the clerks wrote. So what did these early clerks actually do? They copied charters. They recorded land donations to the church Harold, ever eager to solidify alliances, granted generous tracts of land to newly established bishoprics, especially in places like Ribe and Aarhus. They drafted letters, royal missives sent to foreign courts, papal representatives, and rebellious jarls. They issued privileges to monasteries. They kept track of taxes, such as they existed, often in the form of tithes and in-kind tributes, hides, furs, barrels of mead. They also began to catalog laws. This was revolutionary. Before Harold, legal disputes had been settled at local things using oral tradition. A lawman would recite what he remembered. Witnesses would contest or confirm. Resolution was as much social theater as legal principle. But under Harold's reign, the idea began to spread that laws might be consistent, that they might be written down, referenced, even copied. The clerks began compiling what would later become regional law codes, long lists of customs and punishments. Not innovations, but clarifications. The difference was subtle, but profound. Law, once memory, was becoming manuscript. The silent spread of centralization. None of this happened quickly. Harold's clerks were few in number, often confined to cathedrals and bishoprics. The majority of the population remained illiterate, their lives untouched by the quiet world of ink and wax seals. But the presence of writing had begun to alter power. If the king had a clerk and the jarl did not, then the king's words could travel farther, endure longer, and be remembered more precisely. A dispute settled by charter complete with seal and signature was harder to overturn than one settled by word alone. And so slowly, nobles began to acquire scribes of their own. Some were local monks. Others were foreign scholars, drawn from Saxony or the Frankish realms. All brought with them not just Latin, but a world view. That power was best preserved not in arms, but in archives. This shift allowed Harold to reach further than any Danish king before him. It allowed him to proclaim edicts that could be copied and distributed. It allowed him to document fealty, record land grants, issue punishments that could be cited in future cases. In a sense, he traded runes for permanence. But he also introduced something new and unsettling, a form of governance that could act without presence. Bureaucracy and belief. There was a spiritual dimension to all of this as well. Christianity was, from the start, a religion of the book. Its power lay in scripture, in letters, in tradition that was recorded and preserved. For the clerical class, the act of writing was not just administrative, it was sacred. And that reverence extended to the mundane. Recording the number of oxen in a tithe, that was preserving divine order. Issuing a letter of royal protection for a monastery, that was aligning the kingdom with God's law. To the monks of Harold's time, governance was an extension of faith. To Harold, faith was an extension of governance. Together, they built something neither quite intended, a written Denmark. As the quills scratched through vellum in candle-lit scriptoriums, a strange kind of state was taking form, one ruled not just by a man, but by what he had declared in writing. It was slow, tedious, and invisible to most, but powerful all the same. And while the gelling stone would stand for centuries, unmoving and grand, it would be the quiet, forgettable parchment folded, filed, and sealed that truly held the kingdom together. But what happened when these clerks began to contradict the old ways, when written orders clashed with unwritten customs, when ink challenged memory? In the halls of Denmark's early Christian churches, beneath low-timbered ceilings and the drifting scent of tallow smoke, a quiet revolution continued. Harold Bluetooth's clerks, those unsung scribes of the 10th century, were not just copying charters or transcribing royal decrees. They were slowly displacing a system that had existed for generations. Their enemy, not a rival king or an invading force, but tradition, memory, the unwritten laws that had long governed the Norse world. And in a society where memory was everything, replacing it with paper was not merely a matter of process, it was an act of cultural defiance. The customs of the North. Before writing spread across Denmark, laws were not things one read. They were things one heard. The lagmand lawman was the keeper of these spoken codes. He memorized not just rules, but the circumstances of rules, when they applied, how they were interpreted, what precedent they relied upon. The law was a performance. At local things, he would stand before the freemen and recite what was needed. For a stolen sheep, the compensation shall be, or when a man falls by another's hand during Yule. And if challenged, others might recite their own remembered versions. Law was communal memory, but memory was fluid. It changed with time. And that, in its way, was a kind of flexibility, a tool for negotiation, reconciliation, and consensus. Enter the clerks. With their Latin phrases, borrowed legal forms from the Carolingian world, and their relentless habit of fixing law into ink. What had once been interpretive became definitive. The law, once open to local nuance, was now bound by what had been written by a man the disputing parties had never met, and in a language they did not understand. This caused tension. The things still widely used in Harold's time began to encounter written decrees presented by clerics or royal envoys. Here, they would say, is the king's judgment. It has been copied from the chancery and bears his seal. The lawman might nod, or more often frown, because the judgment often did not match the custom. The first conflicts. The most common areas of conflict were land and inheritance. Local customs around property were notoriously complex. Some regions allowed daughters to inherit, others did not. In one place, a nephew could claim uncle's land. In another, such a claim was forbidden. The thing had always worked through such issues with negotiation, citing memory, balancing interests. But a written charter signed and sealed left no room for this. Clerks began to show up at things with these charters in hand. Suddenly, a man who had lived on his father's land his entire life was told the property had been granted to a monastery 10 years ago, recorded in Ribe, confirmed by Harold's own hand. But we never heard this, he might protest. It was written, the clerk would reply. And what is written endures. Resistance in the courts. This shift did not go unchallenged. In rural districts, especially in the north and along the Danish archipelago, things resisted the intrusion of writing. Lawmen refused to recognize documents they had not witnessed. Some charters were burned. Others were rejected outright as fabrications. Clerics responded by invoking divine authority. These charters are not merely legal, they are Christian. To deny them was to deny not only the king, but the church. A dangerous position for any local leader. Over time, the weight of the crown and the cross prevailed. but compromises were made. In many regions, written documents were required to be read aloud at the thing before taking effect. This created a strange hybrid, written law reinforced by oral performance. It wasn't efficient, but it was respected. The changing role of the lawman. As written law grew, the role of the lagman changed. No longer the sole keeper of legal memory, he became a kind of translator interpreting what the documents meant in the context of older customs. He still spoke at the thing, but more often he read from copied scrolls, then explained how these written rules could be applied locally. He was a bridge between past and future. And in this bridging, something vital was preserved. Rather than erasing memory, some lawmen began to record it. Oral customs were written down not because clerks demanded it, but because the lawmen themselves realized that memory could be lost, corrupted, or ignored in favor of royal convenience. So they wrote. And in doing so, Denmark's first law codes began to form, not imposed from above, but coaxed out from within. The clerical network expands. Meanwhile, clerks continued their quiet conquest. Each new monastery added to the administrative web. Each bishopric served as a satellite of royal influence. Literacy spread slowly, mostly among elites, but the presence of documentation became more common. Markets began to demand written contracts. Nobles began to request seals for their family holdings. Even some peasants, those working directly for church lands, began to understand the value of a document that protected their tenancy. What began as a foreign system was becoming domesticated. Not because the people loved bureaucracy, but because they learned to use it. A lingering question. Still, one wonders what was lost. When law shifted from lips to ink, did it also lose its humanity? Did the long negotiations and slow compromises of the thing give way to rigid enforcement? Did the law become more just or just more efficient? For Harold, the answer may have seemed clear. A written kingdom was a united kingdom, and unity in a land of tribes and fragments was worth the cost. But for the farmer who watched his land change hands through a charter he couldn't read. For the woman denied inheritance because of a new rule brought from afar. What did writing bring them besides silence? And what happened when the scribes began to serve themselves? By the final decade of Harold Bluetooth's reign, a quiet but unmistakable truth had settled over Denmark. The voice of the king was no longer his own. It had become parchment, sealed and copied, handed down and read aloud in the market squares, at the courts of nobles, or at the thing where men still gathered under open skies. The scribes, those quiet, ink-stained men of the robe, had become the instruments of permanence. And permanence, as it turns out, was a powerful thing. The final shape of a clerical kingdom. Once the clerks began to write, they did not stop. Each charter, each tithe receipt, each land grant gave rise to another. They were copied and duplicated, sometimes redundantly, sometimes intentionally. Monasteries kept their own records to guard against royal forgetfulness. Nobles commissioned personal clerics to archive their holdings and debts. Even the crown began issuing duplicate copies of important charters, knowing full well that records could be lost, misread, or destroyed by weather, fire, or time. What began as a handful of documents became a cascade. And from that cascade emerged an early version of what modern states call governance. Clerks established formats. Each royal charter began with invocations of divine favor. Each grant followed predictable formulae. I, King Harold, give to, followed by exact land boundaries, rivers, boulders, pastures, oak trees. All that once was passed down orally was now preserved in the chill permanence of ink. By the end of the 10th century, Denmark's core lands, Jutland, Zealand, parts of Scania, had become bureaucratically visible, not just ruled but documented. The rise of the archive. The need to store these documents gave rise to archives rudimentary ones, usually rooms inside churches or in the private residences of bishops or chancellors. There, charters were tied with string, sealed with wax, and catalogued in shelves or trunks. To most people, these rooms were dull, dusty, and dark. To the powerful, they were fortresses. Within them lived the receipts of promise, the proof of loyalty, the justification for war, and the quiet erasure of rivals. For example, if a rebellious noble was captured, the king might ask not for his sword, but for his charter. If a monastery expanded, its documents would trace its authority back to a signed and sealed parchment proof not only of land, but of God's favor as interpreted by the king. These archives became the hidden engines of rule. And though they did not march in battles, they often decided the terms of peace. The clerk is power broker. It would be easy to imagine Harold's scribes as humble, obedient men. Some were. But others, particularly those in royal or ecclesiastical service, became something else entirely. They were the interpreters of written law, the keepers of records, the advisors in legal matters. And often, they were the only people in the room who understood the content of a document being debated. This gave them leverage. If a noble requested a land grant, it was the clerk who drafted it. If the king wished to revoke a privilege, it was the clerk who checked the archive for precedent. If a bishop disputed tithes, it was a clerk who interpreted canon law against royal command. In time, the most trusted clerks were no longer just writers. They were judges, diplomats, chancellors. And from them centuries later would emerge the professional bureaucracies that define modern governance. But it all began here, with a king who wanted to unite his land and a group of men who wrote more than they spoke. The legacy of Bluetooth's paper kingdom. We often remember Harold Bluetooth for the runestones at Gelling Grand, immobile monuments to faith and unity. But his greater legacy may lie in what cannot be seen, the culture of documentation that quietly shaped Denmark's development. Under his reign, the first structures of record-keeping took hold. He did not live to see their full impact. By the time of his death, likely around 986, in battle with his own son Svein Forkbeard, Denmark was still a patchwork, still struggling between old tribal loyalties and new royal ambition. But the stones had been laid, and the pages had been filled. What began with a few Latin words scratched onto parchment would, over the next century, become the foundation of Danish law, taxation, diplomacy, and even identity. Reflection, what the clerks couldn't see. And yet, we must wonder, what did the clerks leave out? Their records are rich in property, in titles, in boundaries and dues. But where are the names of the herdsmen, the thoughts of the women who worked the fields, the jokes shared in market stalls, the stories told to children, the subtle resistances of those who refused to believe that a piece of paper could claim their lives? Bureaucracy, after all, is only as complete as it chooses to be. The scribes wrote a Denmark they could see, a Denmark of order, hierarchy, obedience. But below the ink lay a country far more complex, filled with unwritten customs and unseen lives. So we return to the quiet moment, the scraping of a quill on parchment. And we ask, when the power of a king depends not on who he commands, but on what his clerks record who truly rules. Story 4, The Laws of Jutland, a legal code so dry it caught fire. In the year 1241, under the reign of King Valdemar II, the Kingdom of Denmark was gifted or burdened with one of its most ambitious documents to date, the Jysk Lov, or Law of Jutland. It was a legal code, comprehensive, written, and remarkably dry. Written in Old Danish on parchment, the Jysk Lov was not a theological treatise or a poetic saga. It did not tell stories. It did not invoke the gods. It was instead a list. A vast, unrelenting, sober list of rules. It is not famous. It is rarely quoted in speeches, but for centuries it governed the western half of Denmark and influenced law across Scandinavia. The language was plain, the logic deliberate, the sentences long and crushingly dull. And yet it changed everything. A land divided. By the early 13th century, Denmark had grown complex. There was no single legal code. Instead, each region clung to its own version of custom. Zealand had one tradition, Scania another, and Jutland, sprawling, muddy, and agriculturally rich, had yet another. Each local thing interpreted law based on oral memory and precedent. Legal judgments varied wildly from town to town. Punishments were inconsistent. Feuds were common. And the king was tired of it. Valdemar II, known as Valdemar the Victorious, sought to unify this chaos. Not by conquest, though he'd done plenty of that in Estonia, but by paperwork. He wanted a standard code, something clear, something permanent. And so, with the assistance of bishops, lawmen, and scribes, the Jisk Love was written. Not spoken, not performed, written. The purpose of the code. Unlike earlier legal traditions passed down at the Thing, the Jisk Love was a direct attempt to take custom and freeze it. It was not revolutionary in its content. It didn't invent new laws so much as consolidate old ones, but its form was radical. For the first time in Danish history, a region's entire legal framework was codified in writing and distributed as official copies, often chained to churches or kept in town halls, where the community could refer to them. The text opens with a declaration. With law shall the land be built. But if everyone were to live according to his own will, then would each man be a law unto himself, and the land would be destroyed. It's not an elegant sentence, but it is revealing. Order, not justice, was the goal. Predictability, uniformity. The king's kingdom could not be ruled by thousands of individual memories. It had to be ruled by this. A thick, unwieldy book. The structure of boredom. The Jisk Love is divided into three parts: procedural law, private law, and criminal law. These categories are not clearly labeled in the manuscript, but they are present in the logic. What's remarkable, what might even put you to sleep, is the obsessive specificity. The distance between a fence and a public road. The compensation due for a lost piglet. The rules for marriage dowries, with clauses for cases when the bride died before the feast. The weight of silver to be used in compensation for injuries. The penalty for stealing turf. The obligation to maintain bridges and ditches. There is no drama here, no grand philosophy, just a relentless parade of daily concerns. The text assumes conflict, assumes misunderstanding, and responds with dry, unyielding clarity. For example, the law on oxen theft specifies the number of witnesses required, the minimum distance that constitutes theft versus borrowing, and the value of compensation based on whether the ox was lame. This was not law as morality. This was law as infrastructure. Language as a legal weapon. Perhaps most radical was the language of the code. It was not written in Latin, the traditional language of power and church. It was written in Old Danish. This made the law accessible, at least in theory, to those who were not clerics. It was a political statement. This law was for the people, not just about them. But that doesn't mean it was easy to read. The sentences are long and deeply hierarchical, filled with dependent clauses and convoluted logic. Many were modeled on oral legal formulas that had been translated awkwardly into writing. The result was a kind of bureaucratic poetry, rhythmic, repetitive, and absolutely exhausting. To read the Jisk Love in its original form is to feel the slow weight of order pressing down like damp wool. It does not inspire, it enforces. And that was the point. Implementation and resistance. Though the law was proclaimed by the king, it was not universally accepted. Some local things resisted it, preferring their older customs. In places like North Jutland, oral lawmen continued to judge cases from memory, citing precedents their fathers had told them. Others embraced the code but misinterpreted it, unsure whether a clause about landholders included tenant farmers. There were even cases in which rival interpretations of the same law were read aloud in neighboring towns. So the church stepped in. Copies of the Jisk Love were distributed to major churches, often copied by monastic scribes, and placed in view of the public, usually chained to prevent theft, though not, apparently, from fire. One such copy, preserved for centuries, was eventually destroyed when a church caught fire in the 18th century. Ironically, the most durable symbol of Danish legal permanence, the book proved vulnerable to nothing more than heat and carelessness. The dryness of the law could not prevent it from burning. The quiet power of codification. Still, the Jisk Love endured. Its influence spread beyond Jutland. Versions were adopted in parts of Norway and Sweden. Elements of its private law, especially concerning contracts, inheritance, and property, survived well into the early modern period. In some rural courts, judges quoted clauses from the Jisk Love well into the 1600s, even after newer codes had been written. Its authority lingered. Not because it was beloved, but because it existed. In the chaos of medieval governance, the mere fact of a written, reliable, repeatable law, however tedious, was revolutionary. It created expectations, accountability, and above all, a precedent for a kingdom ruled not by men but by rules. The Jisk Love didn't stir the soul. It didn't tell people who they were, but it told them what to do, and in that it forged a new kind of power. But what happened when the rules became tools for the few? When the clarity of the code was twisted by those who could read it better than others, and when the very precision that promised justice became the barrier to it. To read the Jisk Love is to enter a world where nearly every human interaction, be it a fence dispute, a broken engagement, or a shared ox, has been examined, quantified, and assigned consequence. But for all its dry precision, the Jisk Love did something remarkable. It allowed for law to be used. Not in the abstract, but tactically. The code that was meant to bring fairness and clarity to the land quickly became a tool, sometimes of order, sometimes of quiet exploitation. Because once rules are fixed, the game becomes learning how to play them better than others. The rise of the legal professional. In the generations that followed its creation, a new class of citizens emerged across Denmark, not warriors, not clerics, but legal technicians. These were men, usually of modest means but sharp intellect, who learned the Jisk Love inside and out. Some were scribes attached to bishops or wealthy lords. Others were landholders with time and access to one of the few chained copies in the region. A few were younger sons of minor nobles, lacking inheritance but rich in literacy. They were not lawyers in the modern sense, but they knew enough. And that made all the difference. If a man in Ribe wished to challenge his neighbor's claim to a piece of meadowland, it was no longer a matter of whose family had grazed sheep there longest. It was a question of which clause in the Jisk Love could be cited, and who could summon the required witnesses, and whether the disputed measure of land met the exact definition of a ball or oar. Suddenly, justice was a matter of legal fluency. And fluency was not evenly distributed. The language barrier. Although the Jisk Love was written in Old Danish, not Latin, it was far from universally understood. The style was formulaic and abstract, rooted in legal speech, and often indecipherable without training or context. This created a gap. A wealthy landowner might hire someone to read and interpret the text. A parish priest might advise a villager on what clause applied to his oxen theft charge. But the average peasant, illiterate, overworked, and far from any manuscript, was at the mercy of others' interpretations. This opened the door to manipulation. Some bailiffs began citing portions of the law selectively, enforcing fines or labor obligations while conveniently overlooking clauses that protected peasants from overreach. Others forged or exaggerated the language of the code, knowing most would not question it. There are surviving court complaints in which villagers claimed that a bailiff read from the book, but we could not hear the words, or he said the law punished us but showed no writing. And what recourse did they have? If a law was written, but only the powerful could read it, was it still just? Land inheritance and loopholes. The greatest consequences of the Jisk love were felt in property. One of the law's central purposes was to clarify who owned what and how ownership could be passed on, divided, or claimed. For the first time in Danish history, written definitions governed the distinction between landowners, tenants, and serfs. The code detailed the conditions under which daughters could inherit, rarely, how disputes between siblings were to be resolved, and what fines were due when boundaries were encroached. This had benefits. Ambiguity gave way to predictability. Property disputes could be resolved more quickly, at least in theory. And peasants, once given a written contract under the new legal system, sometimes found their rights more secure. But it also allowed for exploitation. Wealthy landowners, fluent in the code, discovered ways to interpret clauses in their favor. By emphasizing obscure definitions of usable land or inherited field, they could challenge smaller claims. Some even used the Jisk love to acquire land that had long been worked by others by finding some minor flaw in an undocumented claim. Suddenly, ancestral possession meant nothing. What mattered was what could be proved. And proof was ink, clerical influence, and legal centralization. The church, meanwhile, became deeply invested in the Jisk love. Though the law had been secular in tone, commissioned by the king, and free of overt theological language, it quickly became a tool of ecclesiastical governance. Monasteries kept copies, bishops cited it in land disputes, priests acted as legal advisors in rural courts. One unintended consequence of the code was the formalization of church exemptions. Because many church lands were explicitly mentioned in early copies of the law, the church could now cite these clauses to protect itself from taxation or royal interference. The code, meant to unify the kingdom, inadvertently strengthened parallel power structures. And this complexity, the layering of royal law, local custom, and church privilege, created a tangled bureaucracy that, while more ordered than before, was far from equal. A dull but dangerous power. The Jisk love became the sword no one saw coming. It did not incite revolution or inspire poetry. It did not stir passions or crown kings, but it quietly determined the outcome of thousands of lives by stating, in flat and repetitive prose, what could and could not be done. A girl who inherited her father's cottage might lose it because the code required formal male witnesses. A miller's son might be fined for failing to maintain the road, even if the code's definition of road hadn't been clear in his region. A noble might use a clause about unlawful cutting of timber to expel squatters from woods his family had never previously claimed. In each case, the law was clear, but justice was not. The turning point. By the end of the 13th century, attempts were made to revise the Jisk love. Minor updates were issued. Additional clauses were added. In some cases, local judges began issuing interpretations of key sections. But the code had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer a reflection of the people it governed. It had become a reference, often consulted, rarely questioned, occasionally feared. And still it was copied. By hand, page after page. By monks who did not farm. By clerks who did not marry. By scribes who never once borrowed an ox. And yet they shaped the daily lives of those who did. The Jisk love promised fairness through order. But as the centuries wore on, it became clear that clarity was not the same as equity. And as more lives were regulated by those who understood the text and fewer by those who lived within its consequences, one question lingered. When a law is obeyed because it is written, not because it is right, what kind of justice remains? By the dawn of the 14th century, the Jisk love had become something more than law. It was legend. Not in the way sagas become legend with dragons or kings who ride into battle, but in the way bricks become walls. Quietly, slowly, until one no longer sees the individual pieces, only the structure they form. Across Jutland and beyond, it was recited, cited, copied, and invoked. It settled disputes in barns and abbeys, in merchant courts and things. Judges carried copies bound in pigskin. Monks taught its clauses alongside psalms. Nobles consulted it as often as scripture. But permanence brings pressure. And as with all systems built on repetition and ritual, the code that once promised order began, with time, to ossify. Not crumble, but stiffen, until even its strengths began to weigh the kingdom down. A kingdom cast in clauses. The strength of the Jisk love was its clarity. For the first time in Danish history, people across a vast region could expect the same rules to apply whether they were in Ribe or Randers. But its weakness was the same. What had once allowed freedom of local judgment and compromised the very spirit of the things was now being overridden by a fixed, written law that made no allowance for nuance. The code did not change with seasons or circumstance. It applied the same penalty for cutting a lord's timber during drought as it did during flood. It measured land obligations the same whether a peasant's crop had rotted or flourished. It did not acknowledge plague, famine, or misfortune, only deviation. And deviation was punishable. The law that had once promised predictability now delivered rigid predictability, which is to say, inflexibility. It gave shape to a state, yes, but it also froze it. Discontent from below. For peasants and tenants, those without the power to interpret or bend the code, this rigidity became a quiet burden. At first, the law had seemed like a safeguard. Its clauses protected against arbitrary seizure, unrecorded fines, and unproven accusations. And in many cases, it succeeded. Villagers cited it to defend their land or prevent abusive labor demands. But over time, the Jisk love became a sword that cut only one way. Bailiffs used its pages to enforce punishments. Lords cited it to expand holdings. Priests leaned on it to demand tithes long disputed. And the people, they complied or they didn't. In the latter case, they appealed. And often, the appeals were rejected not because they were wrong, but because the law, in its dry indifference, made no space for exceptions. There is a haunting rhythm in the surviving court, records from this period. He pleaded mercy, but the law was read. She claimed widowhood, but the code did not exempt her. They sought postponement for poor harvest, but the ruling was entered. Burned but not forgotten. Ironically, the very physical copies of the Jisk love so heavily relied upon were fragile. Written on parchment, stored in damp churches or wooden town halls, they were susceptible to fire, mold, and decay. One famous copy, kept in a rural Jutland parish, is believed to have been destroyed when a lightning strike burned the church to the ground in the 18th century. Local legend claimed the fire was divine punishment for a judge who enforced a particularly cruel clause about land seizure. It probably was. But the story endured. And with it a quiet acknowledgement that even the driest laws can spark fury. Even order, when too rigid, can ignite resistance. Reforms and replacements. By the 1600s, new legal codes were emerging across Europe. Absolutist kings and reform-minded councils sought to modernize the law, to replace patchworks of medieval codes with streamlined statutes. In Denmark, This movement culminated in the Dansk Love of 1683 King Christian V's great legal overhaul. It was more comprehensive, more modern, and more aligned with royal absolutism. And yet, elements of the Dansk Love survived. Some clauses, particularly those regarding property, inheritance, and local obligations, were copied verbatim or with minimal adjustment. The spirit of its bureaucratic meticulousness lived on in the neat, subdivided paragraphs of the new code. It had not died. It had been absorbed. The legacy in modern eyes. Today, the Dansk Love is often cited in Danish legal history courses as a foundational document, a milestone in the evolution of rule of law. Its famous opening line, "With law shall the land be built," is carved in stone on the facade of the Danish Supreme Court in Copenhagen. It is quoted in speeches, referenced in textbooks, held up as an early example of fairness and order. And yet those who study the full text, clause by clause, will find little poetry. Instead, they will find precision, endless detail, a deep concern for structure. And in that structure, both safety and stranglehold. Reflection, order at a cost. The Dansk Love teaches us something profound about law, about power, and about the human desire to codify what is just. It reminds us that the pursuit of order, no matter how well-intentioned, always risks sacrificing compassion. That once a law is written, it gains a life of its own, immune to plea, impervious to change, until it is rewritten or replaced. And that justice, when filtered through bureaucracy, can become something else entirely, predictable, enforceable, and utterly indifferent. So as we admire the dusty brilliance of the Dansk Love, we must ask, what is the value of a law that is obeyed, if it is no longer understood? And how many people, over the centuries, have been punished not by cruelty but by clauses? Story 5. The Grain Ledgers of Ribe, a market town's paper empire. Ribe is Denmark's oldest town. Founded in the early 700s near the marshy edge of the North Sea, it began as a trading post, simple, wet, and unremarkable to the wider world. But by the high Middle Ages, Ribe had grown into something far more complex. A town of counters, scribes, customs agents, and above all, ledgers. It was a town where paper, not silver, measured wealth. Where tallies of grain mattered more than towers or armies. Where a missing sack of barley could lead to inquiry, judgment, and even jail. This is the story not of kings or battles, but of inventory. It is the story of how one market town became an administrative powerhouse by doing something extraordinarily boring, writing everything down. A town built on marsh and market. The geography of Ribe gave it a modest start but an enduring advantage. Perched on a small river with access to the Wadden Sea, Ribe could trade by both land and water. By the 12th century, it was linked not only to inland Jutland but also to ships that sailed for the Frisian coast, northern Germany, and even the British Isles. Its market days, originally set near the church square, became legendary. Barrels of herring from the North Sea arrived alongside wagons filled with oats, flax, and wool. Traders came from all directions, and with them came the need for records. At first, things were simple. Grain changed hands, weights were announced aloud, payments were made in kind, usually with other goods. But as Ribe's reputation grew, so did the complexity of its trade. Merchants began to operate on credit, orders spanned seasons, disputes emerged. And so the town turned to paper, or more accurately to parchment. The bookkeepers of the market. By the early 1200s, Ribe had an office of recorders known as the grain clerks, kornskriveren. Their job was dull but vital, to record every major grain transaction that passed through the town's regulated market spaces. They were appointed by the town council, and their responsibilities included weighing and recording sacks of wheat, rye, and barley, issuing receipts to merchants, maintaining seasonal grain balances, tracking prices over time, noting shortages or suspicious trades, filing complaints if shipments failed to arrive. Each major transaction was entered into a grain ledger, a thick, hand-bound book organized by merchant name, commodity, and volume. Some ledgers even included notes about weather, such as strong winds delayed the rye ship from the south, payment postponed. Others offered moral observations. Hans of Hedeby has promised 3 barrels but brought 2, claims 1 spoiled, unsure if true. These were not just accounts. They were, in their way, a narrative of economic survival. Rules written in dust. The ledger system gave Ribe its strength, but it also bound it in bureaucracy. Every major trader was expected to register their goods with the town's grain clerks. Skipping this process was treated as fraud. Even local farmers, those who brought only a few sacks to market, were encouraged, and sometimes pressured, to pass through the official weigh station. The clerks worked in a small timber-framed building near the town center, and during peak market seasons, the line to register could stretch for hours. It was not uncommon for a merchant to arrive before sunrise, only to still be standing in line by noon, holding papers, receipts, and, if wise, a small bribe. Because while the clerks were meant to be impartial, paper made power visible. A merchant with a stamped ledger entry could demand payment from a buyer weeks later. A debtor could be chased down by town guards based on an entry made months prior. A farmer whose name was miswritten might find himself accused of underreporting a mistake that could cost him a fine, a stall space, or worse. Bureaucracy as barrier. Of course, not everyone embraced Ribe's ledgers. Smaller traders, foreign visitors, and peasants unfamiliar with the rules often stumbled into the administrative labyrinth unprepared. A traveler from Lübeck might arrive with grain intended for local inns, only to be stopped by an official demanding entry papers. A farmer might trade a barrel of barley for salted fish, only to be told later that he owed tax because the deal hadn't been registered. In one record, a clerk writes, "The Swede named Eric, son of Olaf, arrived with spoiled oats, claims they are fine, refused to register, dismissed but warned may return." The clerks were not enforcers, but their ink carried weight. Once something was entered into the ledger, it had a way of becoming true. Even disputes that had been resolved in person could be re-argued weeks later based solely on what the record said. And in this quiet way, Ribe became a town ruled by paper, order, and obsession. By the mid-13th century, the grain ledgers had become Ribe's institutional memory. Town leaders consulted them not only for economic reasons but for governance. When disputes arose between merchants, the first question was not what happened, but what does the ledger say? When food shortages occurred, it was the grain clerks who knew whether reserves were dwindling. When taxes needed collecting, the town's council used the ledgers to determine who could afford to give and who had underreported their yield. And because these records were kept over years, they also created reputation. A merchant's name, if tied to broken deals, would follow him across seasons. One entry from 1276 reads, "This is the 3rd time Nut of the West has failed to meet his barley count. Advise caution in future dealings." Another, more sympathetic, notes, "Gerd of Aarhus underpaid, but did so with apology and sick wife. Payment made up in rye next quarter." These little notations, so dry, so formal, were glimpses into human lives, filtered through bureaucracy. So we are left with a question. What happens when a town trusts its memory to books, and when those books become the final word? Is it order, or is it a quiet kind of tyranny, built not of walls or weapons, but of stacked ledgers and flickering ink? By the mid-13th century, Ribe's grain ledgers were no longer just tools for tracking trade. They had evolved into something more subtle and more powerful. They were instruments of social control. In a world where most men couldn't read and fewer still could write, Ribe's grain clerks held a quiet, calculable authority. Their office, small and plain, had no army, no crown, no altar. But it had something even kings envied: the ability to define who owed what, and to make that definition stick. As the town grew in commercial sophistication, its dusty ledgers began to shape more than transactions. They influenced reputation, mobility, tax status, even freedom. The merchant class and the ledger elite. In Ribe's early days, merchants were little more than independent traders selling salt, wool, grain, and preserved fish along the coast. But by 1250, a new class had emerged: merchant families, men who dealt in bulk, invested in warehousing, and most critically built personal credit systems. At the heart of these systems were the ledgers. A merchant who consistently appeared in the books, delivering full quantities and on time, gained standing. He could negotiate better stall positions in the town square. He could ask for favorable tax treatment. He could be entrusted with town contracts to provision grain during famine or ship supplies for local lords. But this success came with a price: vulnerability to record-keeping. A single misentry, intentional or otherwise, could tarnish a merchant's name. If the ledger read late, he was late. If it read undermeasured, he had cheated. Protesting was possible but difficult. The books were considered official. Merchants began to hire assistants, not just to carry grain, but to watch the clerks. Trust became currency, so did bureaucracy. And the grain clerks, they were no longer mere scribes. They were, increasingly, gatekeepers of social assent. The peasant's predicament. For rural farmers who brought their grain to market in sacks and carts, Ribe's ledger system presented a maze of formalities. Many came just once or twice a season. They did not speak the dialects of the coast. Some did not speak at all, letting others sell their grain for them. These were not men of documents. And yet they too were logged. Their sacks were weighed, inspected, and entered into the book. Their names, often misspelled, were written down, and sometimes annotated with little notes. Unfamiliar, wears coarse wool, yield low. Returned from last year, same barley, too green. Quiet, paid in advance, may be reliable. Some entries show a kind of sympathetic observation. Others carry the unmistakable tone of judgment. Over time, these notes began to accumulate. Farmers were, in essence, building a paper trail they could not read. And with it, they were acquiring reputations they could neither control nor contest. Bureaucratic disputes. With so much riding on the accuracy of the ledgers, disputes were inevitable. Some were simple misunderstandings, numbers transposed, names mistaken, quantities miscounted. Others were more serious. One famous entry from 1284 records a protest from a merchant named Niels. Claims clerk underweighed his barley by half a measure, demands revision. Clerk refuses, appeal made to council. The appeal was denied. The clerk, though unnamed, was backed by the authority of the book. Niels, despite his standing, lost the case. And so a kind of paper hierarchy emerged. At the top, the clerks, with their ability to write, weigh, and record. Just below them, the merchants, who understood the system and could navigate it. And at the bottom, the laborers and farmers, whose grain was measured but whose voices were not. The ledgers in law and tax. The grain ledgers soon extended beyond commerce. Town councils began to use them for taxation purposes. If a farmer delivered 12 sacks of rye one season, he could expect a tax assessment based on that figure the next year, even if his harvest failed. Some clerks were tasked with compiling annual grain yield summaries, which were then handed to the local bailiff or town magistrate. These summaries determined how much tax was owed, who was eligible for relief during famine, which traders should be fined for late delivery. which shipments were exempt due to prior loss or spoilage. In many cases, the ledger replaced testimony. A man who pleaded poor harvest might be told, "But last year you delivered double." Or a merchant who claimed robbery on the road might be asked, "Where is the note of loss?" No such record appears. And if the book said nothing, it meant nothing happened. Paper, as ever, became reality. Reputation and risk. One of the more unexpected roles of Ribe's ledgers was in tracking risk. Certain merchants became known for their volatile entries, late payments, spoiled goods, mismatched weights. Others were consistently perfect. These patterns over years informed which traders received loans, which were granted warehouse space, and which were blacklisted. An entry from 1292 notes: Jacob of Logum has failed to meet quota for 3 straight markets. Others advised to avoid contracts with him. It's a dry sentence. But for Jacob, it may have been the end of his business. And so, in a world before credit bureaus or insurance firms, the ledger was both a scorecard and a sword. End of section 2. By the close of the 13th century, Ribe's grain ledgers had evolved from records of trade into quiet arbiters of fate. They told who had paid, who had failed, who could be trusted, and who had been forgotten. But in trusting the book so completely, had the town lost touch with the human stories behind the numbers? Could justice truly be weighed in barley and ink? And what happened when the ledgers themselves were wrong, or worse, when they were used deliberately to erase? By the late 13th century, Ribe was a well-oiled bureaucratic organism. The grain ledgers no longer merely recorded transactions, they governed them. The clerks, once scribes in the background, had become administrators of consequence. The ledgers, once tools of clarity, had become repositories of silent authority. And Ribe itself, nominally just a market town, had become a paper-built polity, a place where lives were quietly shaped by numbers inked on parchment. But as the ledgers grew fatter and their reach extended, a question lingered just beneath the pages. What happens when memory is no longer trusted, and only the written word holds truth? Grain, ghosts, and grievances. One of the more haunting effects of Ribe's record-keeping was the way it slowly replaced human memory with official documentation. In a community governed by writing, what was not written began to disappear. A dispute might arise between 2 farmers who had traded grain the previous season. One would claim delivery, the other would deny receipt. In years past, witnesses might be summoned: neighbors, family, other traders. Now the clerk was asked, "What does the book say?" And if the entry was absent due to error, omission, or never having been made at all, the claim itself evaporated. What had once been a world of trust, gossip, and public memory had become a world of boxes checked, names copied, quantities marked. It was, by all measures, more efficient. But it was colder. A farmer who lost his barley on the road and never made it to market was not listed in the book. Therefore, he did not exist, at least not in Ribe's legal mind. The errors that could not be erased. Of course, clerks made mistakes. A miscounted sack, a name misspelled, a date written wrong, a weight recorded in haste or with a smudge so subtle that no one noticed until the ink was dry. But there was no formal system for correction. Once entered into the ledger, the record became authoritative. Even when errors were discovered, they were rarely amended. To change a ledger was to admit fallibility. To cross out an entry was to undermine trust in the entire system. Instead, clerks sometimes added marginal notes, brief explanations scrawled in the corners or sides of the page. Quantity disputed. Farmer insists count was 3, not 2. Clerk stands by measure. Entry challenged on grounds of illness. Claim unsupported. No adjustment made. These small asides, so casual in tone, could determine guilt, payment, or reputation for years. And the person who suffered the most was often the one who didn't know how to read. when the book is weaponized. In some cases, the ledgers were not merely mistaken, they were manipulated. Clerks, despite their supposed impartiality, were human, and humans have friends, rivals, debts, allegiances. A merchant who offended the wrong official might find that his entries were recorded with stricter scrutiny. A rival might receive favorable notes, known for reliable barley, or consistent payer, trusted by locals. In extreme cases, entire entries went missing, or appeared suspiciously late. A farmer who reported his barley might later be fined for failing to declare it, only to find no record of his original statement. There were protests, appeals, even occasional petitions to the town council, but unless a witness could confirm the original entry and unless that witness was respected, the ledger stood. It had in effect become law. And like all laws, it could be bent. The fire that cleansed nothing. In 1320, a fire broke out near Ribes Central Square. It began in a bakery. Flames leapt from the oven to the roof and soon spread across nearby wooden buildings. Market stalls ignited. Warehouses collapsed. The grain clerk's office, though spared from total destruction, suffered damage. Several ledgers were lost. The town panicked not because the grain itself had burned, though some had, but because the records were gone. For several seasons afterward, trade was disrupted. Disputes erupted over who owed what, who had paid when, who was honest and who was. The clerks did their best to recreate the records. They interviewed merchants. They retrieved old notes, but trust had been shaken. And in the rebuilding that followed, the town took an unusual step. They constructed a stone chamber inside the town hall, dry, sealed, and fireproof. This would house the ledgers going forward. It was, in effect, a vault of memory. A shrine not to grain or gold, but to documentation. Ribe Quiet Empire. Though Ribe never grew into a capital city, it wielded power in its own quiet way. Its systems were copied in other towns. Its clerks were recruited to train scribes elsewhere. Its ledgers were cited in regional legal disputes, even in cases where grain had never passed through its markets. What Ribe had built was not just a system of trade. It was a philosophy of governance. That order could be preserved not through trust, but through records. That fairness came not from knowing a man's face, but from knowing his name was written next to a number. And that forgetting, in such a system, was the same as never having existed at all. Reflection, memory, markets, and meaning. The story of Ribe's grain ledgers is not exciting. There are no battles here, no assassinations, no coronations or lost thrones. But there is something more enduring, a lesson about how systems of paperwork shape reality, about how we come to depend on the written word not only to describe the world, but to define it. In Ribe, a man's honesty was no longer judged by character. It was judged by whether the clerk wrote paid. So we are left to ask, when records become more real than people, what happens to the people the records forget? Story 6, Clerical Class, How Monks Became Accountants of the Crown. In the dim, flickering silence of medieval scriptoria, quills scratched softly on parchment. They wrote not poetry, nor sermons, though those, too, were copied. Instead, in certain abbeys across Denmark and northern Europe, monks copied tax rolls, land registries, grain tithes, shipping manifests, census-like inventories. In the absence of a centralized government apparatus, it was monks calm, cloistered, devout who became the early accountants of state power. This is not a tale of heavenly visions or fiery martyrdom. It is the quiet, tedious rise of the clerical class, not just as keepers of souls, but as stewards of numbers. Where God met ledger, the abbey as a bureau. In the early Middle Ages, Denmark had no professional bureaucracy. Kings ruled by charisma and war, not paper. Laws were spoken, remembered, and passed through oral tradition. Taxation was irregular and personal, exacted by force more than system. But monasteries were different. Inside their thick walls lived men who prayed, farmed, copied books, and counted things. By the 10th century, larger abbeys had begun to accumulate wealth in land, livestock, and grain. Managing this required records, and so emerged the monastic cartulary, a bound book of land deeds, tax obligations, and donation receipts. Though originally intended for internal use, these records proved invaluable to kings. They showed who owned what, who paid how much, and who could be taxed again. The crown notices the cloister. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Danish monarchs began to rely on monasteries not just as spiritual allies, but as administrative engines. Need to know how much barley was produced in a region? Ask the abbey. Need a list of which noble families held land in a disputed border region? Ask the monks who tithed them. The most literate men in the kingdom were not in royal courts, but behind monastery walls. And so, quietly, the crown began to outsource the work of state building to the church. In some cases, monks were tasked directly by royal decree to produce records. In others, kings simply borrowed or referenced monastic ledgers during disputes. The church's bureaucratic machine became an arm of royal reach. But this relationship, though useful, was not always smooth. Dual loyalties between cross and crown. A monk's first allegiance was to God, his second to his abbot and monastic order. The king, in theory, came somewhere after that. And yet, the crown increasingly leaned on monastic records to settle disputes, collect taxes, and assert land claims. Monks found themselves caught between duty and diplomacy. Some resisted. One chronicler in Jutland noted in the margin of a land ledger, "The king's men ask again for the count of swine. We know it, but do not send it. They are not for him." Others complied, but carefully. In several monastic tax rolls from the late 1100s, you find two versions of accounts, one for internal church records and one sanitized for royal review. The former might list income from unauthorized tolls, the latter would omit them. In this delicate dance of obedience and evasion, the monks honed a skill that would define them for centuries: bureaucratic discretion. The rise of the notarius. By the early 1200s, a new figure began to appear in both court and cloister. The notarius, a monk trained specifically in clerical duties for civil and royal service. These were men of double identity. They wore habits but carried royal seals. They prayed the hours but also administered charters. They drafted legal contracts between nobles, recorded royal decrees, and distributed them to towns, maintained census-like tallies of taxable households, tabulated tribute from subordinate lords. Their numbers grew as monarchs realized that control over paper was as powerful as control over armies. Some notari remained in monasteries, others were seconded to the royal chancery. They became the first generation of career civil servants, recruited from the quietest corners of the church. The monastic scribe's toolkit. A monastic scribe in 1250 might possess a stylus for wax tablets, a quill carefully cut from goose feather, iron gall ink brewed from oak galls and vinegar, sheets of prepared parchment scraped and smoothed, a guide sheet to maintain even lines, a copy of older records for transcription. Each tool was humble, but together they wielded authority. A tax roll, carefully written in the scriptorium of Esram Abbey, might dictate how much barley a village must surrender. A land charter copied at Abbey might determine the ownership of a forest. Mistakes were rare and costly. In some monasteries, scribes swore oaths before copying royal documents, promising accuracy and integrity. Marginal notes warned future readers of errors. Do not trust the figure above. It was written in haste, we regret it. Even in silence, the scribes acknowledged their power. So we find ourselves with a quiet but profound transformation. In a land once ruled by swords and sagas, monks armed only with ink began to shape the machinery of state. They were not kings, nor warriors, nor even politicians, but they made the records on which all three came to depend. And so we must ask, when men of prayer become men of record, what happens to both the church and the state? As the 13th century deepened, the Danish crown and the church found themselves increasingly intertwined not through theology, but through administration. Kings needed literate men. Monasteries had them. The alliance was at first practical. But practicality breeds dependence, and dependence breeds tension. Monks became scribes. Scribes became notari. Notari became indispensable. And as monasteries grew into bureaucratic centers, the question arose: could the men who served God also serve the state, without serving themselves? Cloisters of calculation. In abbeys such as Sorrow, Esram, and scriptoriums evolved beyond their original spiritual function. No longer just copying psalms or saints' lives, monks increasingly managed royal tithe collections, military provisioning records, landholder registries, bridge and road maintenance logs, legal complaints from local communities. Their output was staggering. Paperwork poured forth, written in a practiced hand, with tight, formal Latin that few outside the church could understand. The documents became the foundation of legal recognition. A man's claim to a piece of land, his record of military service, his exemption from certain taxes, all of it was preserved or denied in the monastery's scrolls. And because many of these monks also served as clerks to the king, church records and royal will blurred. The crown pushes further. By 1250, Danish kings, like their counterparts in France and England, had begun to centralize power. But unlike those larger monarchies, Denmark lacked a vast aristocracy of educated officials. The result: monks filled the gap. They were appointed to serve as royal envoys to local lords, oversee rural tax collection, manage ecclesiastical land disputes, compile censuses of taxable farms and tenants. Some were even entrusted with handling coinage, a task typically reserved for royal mints. And while the king paid well, his expectations were growing. One letter from King Eric clipping to the abbot of Esram in 1274 reads, "The yield from the southern holdings is not full. Your scribes will make account. Let no field go uncounted, and no tithe be forgiven without our seal." This was not a request, it was a royal command. The monks were no longer simply keeping records, they were now agents of enforcement. Monastic resistance. This shift did not go unnoticed or uncontested. Many abbots and priors grew uneasy with their role in royal taxation. The original mission of the monastic life, prayer, contemplation, service, was being clouded by ledgers and contracts. Some resisted outright. In 1283, the Benedictine monastery at Lagum refused a royal order to conduct a new tithe census. The abbot replied, "We are not collectors of coin. We serve the Lord in silence and simplicity. Let the king's men do as they will, but not in our habit." The response was bold. The crown responded by cutting off a grain stipend to the abbey. Most monasteries could not afford such defiance. Others attempted subtle resistance, rounding figures down, delaying reports, losing inconvenient records. But these acts of defiance only highlighted the fundamental problem. Monks had become too good at bureaucracy to be left alone. The clerical middlemen. Between monastery and monarchy stood a new class of intermediary, clerical middlemen. These were monks who split their time between the cloister and the royal chancery. They acted as interpreters, translators, negotiators. They mediated between sacred and secular, parchment and policy. Some served for life in these roles. Others, seeing opportunity, left monastic vows altogether to pursue full careers in royal service. These men retained their education but abandoned their habits. They were often rewarded with land, titles, and influence. The blurred line between monk and minister became a permanent feature of Danish administration. And it raised uncomfortable questions. Was a scribe in the king's chancery still a servant of God? Was an abbot with royal duties still beholden to his monastic rule? Knowledge becomes power. As the church's bureaucratic influence expanded, so too did its reach into secular governance. Monasteries began training scribes not only for their own use, but for noble households. Aristocratic families sent younger sons to be educated by monks ostensibly for religion, but in truth for administration. These boys learned Latin numerals, canon and civil law, techniques of tabulation and account, charters and seals, negotiation etiquette. And with that training, they re-entered the world as bureaucrats, managers, or counselors. The church was inadvertently creating a class of literate professionals, many of whom owed as much to the king as to the cross. It was a quiet revolution, not of arms, but of ink. So we arrive at a strange junction in Danish history. Monks, once men of seclusion and scripture, had become notaries, tax recorders, and royal administrators. The very act of writing, once a sacred duty, had become a tool of statecraft. And thus we must wonder, can a man serve two masters, heaven and the treasury, and remain whole, or must something in him give way? By the early 14th century, Denmark's kingdom had grown more sophisticated but not necessarily stronger. Royal authority stretched further, taxation deepened, and bureaucracy thickened. But much of this progress relied not on castles or cavalry, but on parchment, on ledgers, on clerks. And the vast majority of those clerks still came from the church. Monks, once guardians of prayer, had become the architects of administration. They filed tithes, tracked peasants, certified land deals, and interpreted law. Their ink governed more than scripture. But as the medieval world transitioned, so too did the role of these clerics. In time, their work would outgrow the cloister altogether, and so began the transformation from monk to civil servant. The chancery emerges. The Danish royal chancery, originally a loose circle of literate advisors, grew into a formal institution by the mid-14th century. Its staff included royal secretaries, many trained in abbeys, notari, formerly monks, seal keepers, custodians of official authentication, law scribes, experts in canon and customary law, fiscal auditors, trained in tabular account. They met in rooms lined with scrolls and wax tablets, where they tallied taxes, drafted laws, issued pardons, and recorded land grants. The chancery did not rule the kingdom, but it made rulership possible. What's striking is that this office borrowed heavily from monastic practices. Documents were copied in triplicate, as monks had done with gospels. Tax rolls followed formats first used for ecclesiastical tithe lists. Protocols for land charters echoed the abbey cartularies. Clerks operated in silence, under strict discipline, mimicking the scriptorium's routine. In this way, the habits of monks became the machinery of government. The fade of the habit. Not all monks stayed in the cloister. By the mid-1300s, it had become common for scribes trained in monasteries to leave their vows and take secular positions. Some did so with papal permission, others simply walked away. The path was clear. A monk trained in land accounting might become a royal assessor. One who copied law codes might serve as a judge's clerk. In time, these men married, had children, bought property. They no longer prayed the hours, but they still wrote in the same tight hand, using the same Latin abbreviations, following the same logic of order and preservation. They carried the monastic mind into the world of kings. And so, the Danish civil service was born not in courtly halls, but in stone-walled abbeys, under the light of oil lamps, from the pens of monks who simply wanted to keep track of what belonged to God. The lasting legacy of the scribes. What remained, centuries later, was not the monks themselves but their methods. Denmark's royal land registries echoed monastic charters well into the 16th century. Legal terminology used in early modern courts had roots in monastic Latin. Property disputes in rural towns were still resolved using parchment documents penned by monks 100 years before. Even the basic architecture of the Danish state the idea that government should keep records, audit taxes, and maintain written law owes its foundation to the clerical class. And while many of these monks were forgotten, their ink endured. A charter from the 1200s, signed by a monk who never left his abbey, might be used to settle a border dispute in 1520. A grain tithe list, written by candlelight, might be the only evidence that a village once existed. Their work was not glamorous, but it was foundational. Reflection: the quiet builders of the state. In the end, the story of Denmark's early bureaucracy is not one of great ambition, or conquest, or innovation. It is a story of men in robes, bent over desks, recording what they saw because someone needed to. It is a story of habit becoming habitus of monastic discipline, becoming governmental routine. It is a reminder that nations are not only built in war rooms or palaces. Sometimes they are built in silence by those who count things, organize them, and remember. So as the last monk scribe set down his quill and passed his ledger to a royal hand, we are left with a final thought. When ink becomes power, does the prayer remain or does it fade into the margin of the page?